Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Edwards, Senior Science Advisor with the Office of the Chief Scientist and your host for today's seminar. On behalf of the entire OCS team, I want to welcome you to the Science Seminar series and to today's Science Seminar. First, I'd like to mention, as you may have noticed by the little red dot and the notification when you signed in, that we are recording today's seminar. If you would like to ask a question or have comments at any time, you're welcome to put them in the chat. The chat won't be recorded on the video, so you can submit your questions there anytime. We will make the recordings available on the Environment and Protected Areas YouTube page in the near future. It is my honor today to do the land acknowledgement. I want to respectfully acknowledge that our Edmonton offices are located on the traditional lands and gathering place of the Treaty 6 Nations, and the diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, the Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and Métis and Inuit peoples, and many other whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant communities today. And in keeping with the tradition of gathering, these science seminars provide an opportunity for us to get together to exchange knowledge on very interesting science going on in Alberta within an open learning and sharing environment. The hope being that through our dialogue today, we're able to improve our awareness and understanding and can move that along to support evidence-informed decision-making wherever that occurs. Now, today, to help maintain our call quality, your video and audio has been disabled, and we encourage you to enter any of the questions and comments you have at any time during or after the presentation via the Teams chat function. And I'll read out the questions and comments in the order that they've received. So today we can welcome Ray Boisvert. Ray is a consultant and owner of Boisvert Consulting. She is working with Indigenous communities and post-secondary institutions developing curriculum and programs, strategic planning programs, and various research initiatives. Ray believes that all interactions within the natural world should come from a holistic approach, and that appreciating numerous knowledge systems provides practitioners with well-rounded approach to environmental management. Ray obtained her BSc in Forest Management from the University of Alberta and an MSc in Environmental Management from the University of Auckland. Her master's research focused on working with the Maori Apu in the field of Indigenous self-determination and reconciliation in coastal resource management. She is also a registered professional forester in the province of Alberta. Ray has worked with Indigenous communities across Canada and internationally, post-secondary institutions, industry, and the government of Alberta for almost 20 years. She currently resides in Lac La Biche, Alberta, with her husband and 2 children. So at this point, I will turn it over to you, Ray.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name's Ray. Like Mark said, I just want to also acknowledge that I am presenting from Lac La Biche, Alberta, which is in Treaty 6 territory. And Mark, I think your land acknowledgement was so wonderful that I don't even feel like I need to add anything to it. So it's just wonderful. But I just really, it's really important to take the time to really understand where you're sitting and what territory you're sitting on, and the beautiful First Nations and Métis people and Inuit people who are here before us, and what they did to care for the land. And I think this is really important to acknowledge that, and I really appreciate the government of Alberta's acknowledgement. So thank you so much. So today, I want to talk about kind of tell the story of what Cold Lake First Nations has done to work with the government of Alberta on their Indigenous Lake Monitoring Program. I have had the opportunity to work with Cold Lake First Nations since the beginning of 2020, and it's been just a wonderful experience working with them. Previous to this, working with Cold Lake First Nations, I did come from the government of Alberta. So I did specialize and kind of work with parks and protected areas. So, and I've worked with Indigenous communities, like Mark said, for a number of years. So it's been just really quite wonderful to be able to have this opportunity to work with Cold Lake First Nations. So, the agenda we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk a little bit about Cold Lake First Nations and a little bit about their history. I'm going to talk about why lake monitoring is important specifically to Cold Lake First Nations, but also just Indigenous peoples. I'm going to talk about the ILM program. and program goals. And then I'm going to talk about how Cold Lake has been involved in the lake monitoring program. They have been involved for a number of years. And I'm going to dive into more detail about one project that we worked on in the Indigenous Lake Monitoring Program, and that is for Bork Lake. I'm going to talk about sort of, the project design, some of the results and the outcomes that came from that. And then we're going to go into what lake monitoring could look like. So through the project with Bork Lake, we did some community work. We came up with some ideas of what lake monitoring could look like, specifically in the Indigenous Lake Monitoring Program. So Cold Lake First Nations, you can see on this map here, Cold Lake First Nations is obviously the communities are located near Cold Lake, but their traditional territory spans across Alberta and Saskatchewan. You can see here the traditional territory is mostly half in Alberta, half in Saskatchewan. It's located in Treaty 6 territory. It spans up in the northeast of Peter Pond and then sort of the southwest down to Bonnyville. But in the heart of Cold Lake First Nations traditional territory is Primrose Lake here, located in the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range. I don't want to get into too much detail, but I really urge everyone to really look at Cold Lake First Nations history, especially when it comes to the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range. Cold Lake members have lived throughout the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range for generations, but in 1952, they were forcibly removed from the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range, obviously for the Department of National Defense to create the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range. And it had a really big, and still today has a really big impact on the community. However, since that time, there has been some negotiations and agreements with the federal government to allow access of Cold Lake First Nation members back into the air weapons range. However, it is still limited as to where they're allowed to go and when they're actually allowed to go into the range. But I just really wanted to show specifically where the traditional territory spans across Alberta and Saskatchewan. So lake monitoring from Cold Lake First Nations experience and sort of perceptions of why it is really important is because I'll show a map in a couple slides about sort of the fragmentation of Cold Lake's traditional territory. But the vast majority of their territory has been taken up by farming, urban development, obviously military facilities like the Air Weapons Range, oil and gas, forestry, gravel pits. So it's really important to understand sort of how this sort of habitat fragmentation is really impacting their traditional territory, specifically when it comes to watersheds and their lakes. It's really also important to know and to monitor long-term change over time. And hopefully this monitoring of long-term change can really address community concerns. The community wants to find out what is causing the change, and also how they really want to, sort of change or be involved in making change on the land, specifically when it comes to resource management actions within the traditional territory. And as we know, obviously habitat fragmentation really has an impact on the land and the animals, and the water. So it has a direct linkage to overall long-term food security of community members. So the Indigenous Lake Monitoring Program, I've had the opportunity to work on it for a couple of years now, but it is obviously a Government of Alberta-led program. Staff from the Airshed and Watershed Monitoring Branch. I'm not too sure if they're still called that, obviously with the cabinet shuffle. They are sort of the pioneers and the lead when it comes to the Indigenous Lake Monitoring Program, and they're really wonderful people to work with. But this is a Government of Alberta-led program. It did initially start in 2016, 2017, when Big Stone Cree Nation had concerns about sort of the health of the fish up in North Wabasca Lake. So this project was piloted specifically first with Big Stone Cree Nation, and it has expanded to working with other First Nations, including Cold Lake First Nation. So here are the program goals. I want to just describe some of the program goals. A couple slides, I'm going to talk about how these program goals are working and if they're not working, and we're going to look specifically at each one. But I just wanted to address them. So there's the first one is establishing respectful relationships between Indigenous environmental technologists and government scientists. A big part of the Indigenous Lake Monitoring Program is training community members to actually get onto the lake and monitor the lake and measure certain Western science parameters. So it's really establishing that respectful relationship between government and Indigenous members. It is to create community capacity for collecting data, like I said. And it's also to address knowledge and information gaps on lake ecosystem health that are of common interest to the government and also to Indigenous communities. And one of their long-term goals is to support the shared stewardship of Alberta's lakes through the best available Indigenous and scientific knowledge. So this is the long-term goal is really one of the goals I really want to emphasize on and talk about how, you know, in the end, we could probably definitely achieve this. So Cold Lake has been involved in the ILM program since 2018. We have mostly been involved by having our members trained and actively participate in the lake monitoring with GOA staff. We first monitored Cold Lake in 2018, and then Bork Lake was monitored in the 2018-2019 year. So let's get into the Bork Lake monitoring project. So Bork Lake, or also known as Green Jackfish Lake, obviously was monitored in 2019 season. But the government of Alberta approached Cold Lake First Nations in early 2020 to participate in what they called a knowledge co-production program for Bork Lake. So Bannister and other authors obviously has defined knowledge co-production as a way of respectfully braiding Indigenous, local, and scientific ways of knowing to develop a holistic understanding. So when the government of Alberta approached Cold Lake First Nation, they kind of, you know, it was a very open. It said, you know, we really want to create this knowledge co-production program with you. We don't really want to define what it is. We want Cold Lake First Nations obviously to take the rein and decide the path forward. This was pretty exciting to Cold Lake First Nations because, to be honest, in the past, it's usually having members or government members coming to Cold Lake, and you know sometimes decisions have already been made of what programs are going to look like. So to create sort of a project when it comes to Bork Lake, the way that the community wanted to create it was pretty significant. We'll talk a little bit about, you know, some other ideas that the community has when it comes to, you know, the First Nation having even more reins when it comes to the program, but we thought this was pretty good. And it was a really great way to, you know, start building a really long-term relationship with government staff through doing this. So Bork Lake, I'll just show you here. So Bork Lake, if everybody can see, is right here, the red stars on it. So it is just northwest of Cold Lake, just south of the Air Weapons Range, and it is located in the Beaver River watershed. So Bork Lake has been a focal lake that has been used by Cold Lake First Nation members for generations. It's for subsistence activities, exercise of their treaty rights. It's a place that has been used, continues to be used, and hopefully be used for many generations more for hunting, fishing, berry picking, and trapping. There's a historic Cold Lake First Nation settlement located in the area and is connected to other significant focal lakes. And members still continue, obviously, to camp there, support their fishing, berry picking, and hunting activities. So when we think about the knowledge co-production program, just kind of going back of sort of the timeline. So Bork Lake was monitored in the summer of 2019 with Cold Lake First Nation members. The government approached us in early 2020 to sort of create this knowledge co-production project. So, but an important thing to note here is that the scientific results of the sort of the Western science parameters that was measured on Bork Lake was already provided, or the data was already provided and already analyzed by the government of Alberta. So Cold Lake First Nation wasn't sort of responsible to really analyze the data. We didn't really necessarily have to use the scientific data. It was more sort of what did Cold Lake First Nation really want to understand about Bork Lake when it came to this program. We signed a contract with the government of Alberta in March of 2020. And right after that, we really started work with the community. You will note kind of on the timeline here, March 2020 is when we started community work. And if everybody knows what happened in March 2020, it's kind of the world shut down with COVID. So we were lucky enough that we did a lot of community work before things shut down, but it really also kind of hindered our timelines a little bit when it came to sort of other community work that we could have done. But I think for the circumstances we were in, I think it was okay. So in the summer of 2019, you could see Bork Lake here. You could see the composite and main site sampling sites of where Bork Lake was sampled. What was measured for the Western science parameters was water temperature, dissolved oxygen, water chemistry, including dissolved ions, nutrients, metals, aquatic organisms like phytoplankton and algal toxins. There was also fish communities were assessed, like walleye and northern pike populations. However, they were assessed in sort of their fin assessments that they do in 2011 and 2016. So it wasn't done at the same time as in 2019, but you know the lake is still measured when it comes to fish communities. Another thing you could see on the map here, I'm sure a number of you guys are noticing, is how fragmented the land base is around Bork Lake. It is surrounded by oil and gas activity, which is very challenging and is of a big concern to Cold Lake First Nation members. You know, one person can say, well, look, it just, you know, potentially opens up the site. It's easily, you can access Bork Lake even better because you could just drive down these roads and get there. But that's not the reality when it comes to going on the land and, you know, accessing land, because oil and gas companies like to have their own rules of who can go on their sites and not. So it's very intimidating for a lot of members to try to access places that they have accessed for many, many years. Okay, so when we thought about designing this Bork Lake project, it was really important that we wanted to understand what the community already knew and what they wanted to do. And we really wanted to design this program around the needs of the community. So that's really important is, you know, like, for example, I could have gone in there and I said, oh, I could have gone in there and said, this would have been a really good project to do and really swayed it. But I really wanted the community come to us and tell us what they really wanted to know about Bork Lake. However, we did already know some things based on work we've done in the past about Bork Lake. So we do know that for many generations, Cold Lake First Nation members have an innate relationship with Bork Lake and its watershed. We know that members are concerned about fish, water quantity and quality within its traditional territory. And specifically to resource management, we know that Cold Lake First Nation wants to be more involved in resource management programs and resource management decisions, and they don't want to participate in a program if there's really is no end result. There's been so many times that Cold Lake First Nations has spent many, many hours and resources on programs and really nothing has come from it, right? So definitely now and moving forward, the community really wants to be involved in meaningful programs that actually there's tangible results in the end and actually change can happen. That's really important when it comes to First Nations, specifically Cold Lake First Nation. So what did we want to know? Specifically on Bork Lake, we did know generally, obviously, that Cold Lake First Nation members have used Bork Lake for many generations. However, we really wanted to know the specifics of when and where and how do they use Bork Lake in the past and presently. Has Bork Lake changed over time? Has the land base changed over time? Has the water changed over time? What are the main concerns about Bork Lake? What is the community concerned about? And we wanted community members to review the scientific data. So this data was already analyzed by Government of Alberta staff, but we wanted the opportunity for Cold Lake First Nation members, specifically the people who are out there actually doing the monitoring of the lake, to actually see the data that they retrieved and how it was analyzed. So that was a really important part too. It's sort of that, you know, full circle approach when it comes to actually being on the land and the results from it. Other things we wanted to know specifically about the Indigenous Lake Monitoring, just the program as a whole. Does the current program meet the needs of the community? Do Cold Lake First Nations members want to become more involved in the ILM program? So currently, right now, their only involvement is actually doing the monitoring themselves, but there really wasn't any more involvement other than that. was Cold Lake happy with that? Maybe they wanted more involvement, and maybe they were just okay the way it was. Are there current gaps in the program? And then we have monitored Cold Lake, we have monitored Bork Lake, but what other lakes are important and should be monitored going forward? So based on what we knew and what we wanted to know, we came up with a number of objectives. So some of the objectives was obtaining baseline data of long-term water quality trends for Bork Lake. We wanted to interview Cold Lake First Nation members about the concerns and issues of aquatic health. We wanted to address some of the questions raised by the community regarding water quality and health. We wanted to build additional capacity for collecting scientifically credible aquatic ecosystem data. And we wanted to create sort of a knowledge co-production process, which used an Indigenous and scientific knowledge to develop water monitoring parameters to be used in the Indigenous Lake Monitoring Program. I'm specifically going to get into the last objective, and I'm going to talk in more detail about this and how we actually were able to create sort of these common water monitoring parameters that we hope could be used in the future in the Indigenous Lake Monitoring Program. So project design is we monitored the lake, we signed a contract, we did a focus group interview, we transcribed the interviews, we analyzed them, we created a report, we did community review. The government of Alberta reviewed the report, which was quite wonderful because they had a lot of really great feedback, and we really wanted to sort of co-create something with them. So that was a really good opportunity. We did another community review, and from that came out a final report. So let's talk about the focus group. So we decided to do a focus group because we wanted to create sort of a relational approach, sort of activity with community members. We wanted to create a conversation rather doing one-on-one interviews. So we first started off with a focus group. There was the potential of doing one-on-one interviews with members if we decided that maybe some more feedback or, sort of updates or, we had more questions. However, if you notice in the date, it was March 2020, we did a focus group, and a week later, things got shut down. So we didn't have the opportunity to do one-on-one interviews, but we were quite happy with the focus group and the conversation we had with community members. We interviewed members who have knowledge and or have used Bork Lake. So it was really important. The people that we interviewed actually have been to Bork Lake, used Bork Lake in the past or present, and so they have the knowledge of the land base. So the group included elders, land users, staff, people who did the monitoring, a mixture of men and women, different ages. It was a good group of people. I would say we had around 15 15 members there, and it was a really great conversation. The focus group was it was over one day. We did divide it up into sort of two sessions where we did the interview, we had a conversation, and then the second part was we reviewed the scientific data from Bork Lake. So it was important when we designed this focus group is we reviewed the scientific data of Bork Lake. Secondly, instead of before the interviews, because we really didn't want to bias what community members were going to say about Bork Lake. They probably would have said the same thing afterwards, after hearing what they said before and after. However, we really wanted to make sure that their feedback was their own feedback and it wasn't swayed by any sort of data that was already out there. So we transcribed the interviews and we got and we analyzed the data and we did a thematic analysis. So what came from it was these themes or value components. So the main concerns about Bork Lake was obviously fish, and that includes things like fish populations, fish size, also fish health. Another one is fishing activity. That includes about, when, what time of year people go fishing on the lake. Also, another big one was access. That was a really important component when it came to fishing activity. And the other two was water quality and water quantity. So these themes emerged from the interview data. And then we also, there's a couple other things that emerged from the interview data as well. One was what came from it was sort of these IK or Indigenous knowledge based indicators. and descriptions emerged. For example, under each theme, community members talked about sort of indicators of a way to really evaluate each sort of ecosystem theme or value component. Obviously, these indicators have been developed through observations and knowledge of Bork Lake over time. They are indicators that are very meaningful to the community. And like I said, they are used to evaluate each theme. So for example, when it comes to water quality, an indicator used to evaluate water quality, it would be clarity of water. And clarity of water, for example, from community members means, is the water oily? Is it foamy? Is there algae growth? Waterfowl density, how many birds in an area is found, and so forth. Another sort of when we did the analysis, what also came through the interview data was sort of these community-derived thresholds. So when we think about thresholds, we think about sort of what makes sort of the Bork Lake desirable or undesirable, right? So what are those characteristics for each theme that's out there? So for example, a threshold of environmental change is that when it comes to drinking water, water is no longer acceptable for consumption if foam is present. So it's pretty much like if foam is present, that is a community's threshold saying we're no longer going to drink the water. If there's no foam on the water, then the water is obviously clean enough to drink. So it's really important when it comes to thresholds, that thresholds are important for the continuation of use of Bork Lake, but also the continuation of use of other resources on the land. I wanted to talk a little bit about the thresholds, but we're not going to dig deep into it. I really wanted to focus on this presentation about sort of those IK-based indicators, and so forth. Okay, so when it comes to the Indigenous Knowledge indicators, if we go back and we look at those objectives about, or not really objectives, but what we already knew is that Cold Lake First Nation doesn't really want to be involved in a program. There's no results coming out of it. So we thought, from the community standpoint, we thought, well, we know what our Indigenous knowledge or our community-based indicators are. Perhaps we can give this to the government of Alberta and they can start monitoring it. However, a lot of the data that was coming out of obviously was qualitative data. We do know that the government of Alberta currently, right now, I think they're getting better, is sometimes when it comes to just monitoring specifically, they don't really understand or know what to do with qualitative data. So we wanted to create sort of a common language. We wanted to look at the RK-based indicators, we wanted to look at the Western sign indicators, and we wanted to create common indicators. So something that was in sort of a common language where the needs of the community could actually be achieved, and the government of Alberta could hopefully monitor what the community wanted to be monitored, right? So yeah. So for example, we thought was also when it comes to, sort of that ethical space, that doing this really worked in sort of good faith in that place of ethical space, right? So when we think about ethical space, it's really about connecting and working within the two knowledge systems. We believe that it provides a more holistic understanding of the aquatic environment. It really builds bridges amongst people. And one of the common sort of the program goals of Indigenous Lake Monitoring is to really build bridges. It's really to, create respectful relationships. And we thought perhaps this is just one way of really creating respectful relationships and building bridges between government scientists and community members is, why don't we sort of create, include common parameters that really achieve the needs and the concerns of the community. So some criticism with this and with this practice is some people obviously know is that, well, you're just trying to fit IK Indigenous knowledge in specific places where it can be used. It's sort of that extractive method or that extractive process of Indigenous knowledge. However, what we're doing is we're not comparing, both knowledge systems. We're not, one is meaningful, one is not meaningful. They're only meaningful unless they corroborate. We're not going there. We just really want to work in a common sort of language and approach with the government of Alberta. So what we did with this is we had all our ecosystem themes. We created we found out what all the Indigenous knowledge indicators are specifically for Bork Lake. So it's important to know that this is just for Bork Lake and not as within Cold Lake First Nations traditional territory as a whole. And we looked and said, okay, for example, fish health. Something that IK description for fish health would be growths on the fish. We looked at the current water monitoring parameters that are measured, and we thought, is there a current water monitoring parameter that actually measures this or not? And in this list, we wrote down everything that it was currently monitored and measured, and would it actually meet the needs of the community? For example, fish health, nothing at this time is being measured within the Indigenous Lake Monitoring Program to meet the concerns about, fish health. So we are able to know that there's some measurements that are already, some parameters that are already being measured, and there's some that definitely there is some gaps within the current program. So we created a list of some of the common indicators and parameters that could be included into this Indigenous Lake Monitoring Program to really meet the needs of Cold Lake First Nation members. For example, we talk about fish health as an example we used in the previous slide. Is like, well, what parameter can be measured to address the concerns of fish health? So, for example, liver and gonad somatic indices, body condition, parasites. Another one was, for example, we talked about northern pike populations, the size of northern pike. Community members addressed that, it'd be really interesting to know what the food sources are for northern pike. So we do know fin assessments happen, but we also, we thinking, okay, maybe during fin assessments, there could be a new level of monitoring happening, looking at food web linkages. So there's things that we can think that can be added to the current ILM program that can really help achieve the needs of the community and also add more data to the government of Alberta. Okay, so that's a quick summary of the Bork Lake project and the opportunity, what we got to work on, and just showing how, we can create common indicators that can really help out the government of Alberta and also help out Cold Lake First Nation with their concerns within their traditional territory. So we'll go back and look at, did the Bork Lake project support ILMP goals? So we look at the goals and we think about, okay, yes, definitely there's respectful relationships happening. Community capacity, there's definitely that is happening. Addressing knowledge and information gaps on lake ecosystem health that are of common interest to Indigenous communities and provincial scientists. Yeah, I think so. I think we definitely, through the Bork Lake project, we definitely address some of the knowledge and information gaps, specifically from the Cold Lake First Nation side. That is something that, could be worked on. But when we look at the long-term goal about supporting shared stewardship of Alberta's lakes to the best available Indigenous and scientific knowledge, we feel like Bork Lake is definitely, that project is a step in the right direction. But there's more that definitely can be done when it comes to supporting sort of shared stewardship. So when you think about supporting shared stewardship, you can really define that as, for example, if you're sharing something, you're obviously in a partnership with someone. Right now, I don't necessarily think there is a partnership happening between the government of Alberta and Cold Lake First Nation, specifically ILMP. However, I think it's very easy to get there, and I'll just show you some examples of how that can be achieved through what lake monitoring could look like. So some of the current gaps is, we want an inclusion of a common set of indicators in regular monitoring, like we talked about. But we also understand that, we don't necessarily want these projects to be one-off projects where the government comes to us and says, hey, what is your indigenous knowledge specific to like Bork Lake? Or what is your indigenous knowledge specific to a protected area or caribou? Can you share with us? You can't really approach a community and sort of have that extractive process without recognizing the Indigenous knowledge systems as a whole, right? So that is when it comes, it's a very holistic perspective that needs to be achieved when working specifically with First Nations and Cold Lake First Nations. And that is, it needs to be holistic. Cold Lake First Nation needs to be involved through every stage of a program life cycle. the way we were involved in sort of the knowledge co-production program for Bork Lake is we were involved in the monitoring, and then we got involved in a contract after the fact, after the scientific data was analyzed and interpreted. The preference when it comes to specifically like a smaller project like Bork Lake, the community should have been involved in the monitoring program and the planning phase all the way through the end. So if you look at a program like life cycle, this is a very simplified version of a program life cycle. From design, implementation into evaluation, the community needs to be involved in every step of the way. I'm going to talk about specifically how things that could change specifically when it comes to this program, but you could also use this example for other programs as what can be thought about and changed in each phase. So in the program design, the program should blend the needs of the government of Alberta, but also be grounded in Indigenous community-based observations of social and environmental change. What's required is flexible management structures to allow collaboration. So, it's just being flexible and, understanding that sometimes timelines can shift or need to shift. Annual community-led meetings to identify monitoring needs and methodologies. So Indigenous-based methodologies are really important. There needs to be adequate program inputs. This is funding, time, expertise, sort of a redevelopment of contract templates that are a bit outdated, specifically working with First Nations, and also really addressing community protocols and respective ownership of data. When it comes to implementation, Cold Lake First Nation has been involved in the implementation part as being actively involved in monitoring these lakes. And we know that implementation really is the heart of the co-production process, and it's the most active and apparent. But Cold Lake has been, actively involved in the implementation. However, another thing that could happen for Cold Lake First Nation to be involved in implementation is, Indigenous data analysis and interpretation. So, for example, when Cold Lake First Nation members are out monitoring lakes like Bork Lake, it would be really interesting for Cold Lake First Nations members to actually be the ones interpreting the data rather than just government staff or scientists taking on that data analysis role. It could be like sort of a partnership opportunity where the data is analyzed together. It could be just given to the nation to analyze themselves. It could be a combination of the two, but it's really important that there is involvement, both in the interpretation of that quantitative data, but also the qualitative data. For instance, being involved in sort of analyzing interview data themselves, being the ones actually doing the interviews, First Nation members interviewing First Nation members, and so forth. And it's really important because when you have sort of Western scientists analyzing, it leads to more of like of a Western interpretation of the data rather than, sort of an Indigenous, I guess, interpretation of that data, and so forth. It also provides the opportunity for Indigenous land users to really scrutinize scientific predictions on their own terms. And this really gives them an opportunity to sort of trust and respond to science in a different way, and hopefully answers communications and understanding of impacts. The last phase of evaluation is it's really important that very regularly that the First Nations have the opportunity to review program goals. So they're the ones actually reviewing these program goals, saying, are they actually being achieved or not? And what can be done to actually make these achievable, or do they need to be changed, right? So, when it comes to evaluation, this requires regular community engagement sessions to review projects and programs. So, it's really important that Cold Lake First Nation becomes sort of becomes a partner with the government of Alberta. And I know the government of Alberta staff has been very willing and very wonderful when it comes to this program. And it's just been a great opportunity. And that's it, guys. So I got through a lot of material really fast there. And thanks, guys, for the opportunity. And I guess we'll just open this up to any questions.
I guess first I want to thank you for a really interesting talk. Thank you so much.
As a reminder, if you're not on the mailing list to receive invites to our science seminars and would like to be added to it, or if you and your team has work that you would like to share in an upcoming science seminar, please contact the OCS at aep.ocs@gov.ab.ca.